All right, direct sowing. This is something that I feel like is lesser known in the gardening world. And direct sowing with seeds is really one of my favorite things to do as a gardener. So, using seeds to landscape your yard can save you a lot of money. Most seed packets will come with 50 to 100 seeds, so you can see how many plants you can get for just a little bit of money. In this picture, here's a flower bed that I direct sowed in front of my house in late spring a few years ago. And it's one of my favorite flower gardens that I've ever grown, and it didn't cost me much at all, about the cost of 8 little seed packets. So you can really see how just a few seed packets can go so far if you know how to direct sow. Direct sowing means planting seeds directly in the ground versus starting them in little containers of some kind and transplanting them out. Some varieties resist transplanting, and so sometimes you'll do much better to direct sow. Also, I like direct sowing because it can save me a lot of time. Once the seeds are up, I don't have to repot them or replant them. They're just already where they need to be, and also I don't have to store them or grow them somewhere inside. So also, if you don't have a lot of space to grow seeds indoors like me, this can be really awesome. So direct sowing really is my preferred method over growing under lights, although I do both. So the reason you sometimes won't direct sow is the conditions aren't always conducive to direct sowing. If it's too hot, it can be really tricky to get seedlings to germinate because the ground dries up so fast. Or especially if you want to jump start your plants in late winter, you'll want to start your seeds indoors and then move them out because obviously it will be too cold for seedlings to get going. Flower farmers and commercial growers oftentimes don't direct sow depending on their crop because they might get a little less control. They like to be able to put seedlings exactly where they need them to be. Oftentimes they're using landscape fabric or other types of methods. But for us, the home gardener, direct sowing can be awesome. In my opinion, like I said, this is one aspect of especially ornamental landscape flower gardening that I think people don't realize they can do. So instead of buying a whole bunch of flats of flowers that they've got to go out and plant, they could just buy a seed mix or a set of seed packets and direct sow them in the fall or early spring and have an abundance of unique flowers everywhere. So, how to do it? I'm going to talk about direct sowing flowers and then vegetables. So, direct sowing flowers is usually best done in late fall when beds are all cleaned out, or in the early spring just before the world wakes up. The number one rule to growing seeds is seeds cannot dry out, not even once. If they dry out, they die and they fail to germinate. So, this is why trying to direct sow in high heat can be a little hard. It's not that it can't be done, but the top layer of soil will dry out so quickly that usually the little seedlings dry up before they can make it very far. So that's why spring is really ideal for germination because it has cooler temperatures and it usually gets quite a lot of rainfall. So also keep in mind something good to know is that some seeds will have optimal germination temperatures, meaning when the soil is a certain temperature, they'll germinate at the highest rates. And that's getting a little technical for the home gardener, but if you do have some kind of trouble with starting seeds, you can maybe factor that in. Also, something to know about germination is that the larger the seed, the easier it is to germinate, and the smaller it is, the more likely it is to dry out, and it's going to have a little bit of trouble. It's going to be just a little bit trickier. So, in order to have success direct sowing, you need to first prepare the ground. So, rake out the area so that your soil is nice and loose and work in some organic matter of some kind of healthy soil that will feed your seedlings as they work to germinate. So once you have a nice surface to work with, scatter your seeds. If you're doing different varieties in one area, be aware of scale and put shorter plants in front and taller plants in the back so that you won't get big, tall plants on the sun side that shade the rest. And be aware that not every single seed you plant will germinate. So plan for that. And and know that when direct sowing, your germination rates are going to go down more so than when you sow indoors. So once you've placed your seeds, take a nice soft soil and scatter a layer over the top of your seeds. So I like to use peat moss for this, but you could also use coconut coir or a nice fine potting soil, sometimes even sand. And I put it about no more than a quarter of an inch or a centimeter thick. And then once you've done that, you'll tamp down the area, like just stomping your feet, or you'll roll the area if it's a larger area with a roller, if you have one. And it's what's happening here is it's important that the seeds have contact with the soil. So if you're in a colder zone and you're direct sowing in the fall so that the seedlings automatically emerge in the spring, then that's it. You don't even need to water and you're done as soon as it's all tamped down. You can just leave them until they decide to wake up in the spring. So like I mentioned before, springtime is ideal for germinating seeds. And so usually conditions and temperatures will be such that the little seedlings will just come up. Fall sowing really is going to be your most time-friendly way to direct sow because you can just do it and then the seeds come up on their own. And when the spring comes, keep an eye out for your seedlings to start coming up because it's often a little later than you might expect. And lots of times, just when I've thought that they're not coming and it didn't work, I see them poking out their heads. And so you'll want to watch to make sure they aren't drying out because as soon as they start to come out, they need to have consistent water, a little bit of overhead water if they're not getting enough from the rain. So that is fall sowing. That's kind of how that works. If you're direct sowing in the spring after the last frost, so that's what you want to do. If you're sowing in the spring, you'll want to wait until after your last frost, and then you'll water the area with a gentle overhead spray. So you're going to follow the same steps as you did with the fall sowing, but then you'll water it. And the key again is to make sure that the surface never dries out. And this is the part that's going to be so custom to your area. If your area is really dry and if you get higher temperatures and if you get very little rainfall, then how often you water is going to be so different. So look at your weather and conditions and make the call about how often you'll need to water in the next 7 to 14 days so that your seeds will germinate. Because that's for flower seeds, that's about how long it takes, 7 to 14 days. Sometimes could even be an extra week depending on conditions. So lots of times what I'll do is I'll watch the weather and I'll choose to direct sow on a day right before it's going to rain. And if you live in a place with warm winters, then you could do this process in the fall and start growing throughout the warm winter. So customize this information to your area based on temperatures and frost dates. If you have a sprinkling system, you can automate your water and have your sprinklers in that zone come on once a day or 3 times a day for a few minutes. So because I have a sprinkling system, what I'll do if I'm spring sowing is I will set that zone where my seeds were planted to go off like every 3 hours during daylight for 5 minutes. And I'll do that until I see the seedlings coming up. And then once I see the green, I usually decrease my watering to once a day and then down to every other day and then twice a week and then finally to once a week for a longer amount of time, and I'm not doing overhead spray anymore. So I go from overhead spray to then drip irrigation is what I use. So another tip is after you direct sow and really soak the area, you could cover it with burlap or straw or grass clippings to keep the soil underneath moist until you get germination. And like I said, the larger the seed, usually the easier time it will have germinating, and also the deeper you will plant it. So a general rule is to plant seeds about 2 times as deep as the size of the seed. So the smaller the seed, the easier it will be to dry out. So just keeping that in mind. So I recommend that you experiment a little bit with direct sowing. Try sowing in the fall, try in the middle of winter, in the early spring, in the summer, and see what works in your area. Pay attention to days to maturity on your seed packets. So sunflowers, for example, could be sown in the middle of summer, and because they're so quick to mature, they can give you a beautiful display in late fall. Some seeds germinate really easily, like zinnias and sunflowers. So you could experiment with those to start if you're kind of intimidated by growing with seeds. But just get to know your area and your particular needs, and you'll be amazed at what you can grow with very little time and just a little bit of know how. So let's talk about vegetable seeds. Vegetable seeds have higher germination rates than flowers, and they also germinate much faster as a general rule. So some vegetables like beans and pumpkins will resist transplant and are really easy to get seeds up. So it'll be better to just direct sow them rather than starting them as plants indoors. So with vegetables, because they are planted deeper and larger, you won't have to be so careful with keeping the soil that top level moist. Um, for the first few days of planting beans or pumpkins or squash, you'll need to water with overhead water, probably just about once a day rather than, maybe 3 to 4 times a day like you would for flower seeds. Again, I'm really this would be so custom to your area. So I give those numbers of times a day, but that might not be the case for your area. So keep that in mind. So if it's cold and rainy for a long time, then sometimes seeds can rot. If you live in a climate like that, then you might start your vegetable seeds in a windowsill and plant them out after they've come up after a few days. Seeds rotting really happens more with vegetable seeds more than flower seeds. So anyway, that's just a little tip for troubleshooting if you run into that at all. As I mentioned before, different seeds will have different germination temperatures. Most will start to germinate when temperatures are between 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit or somewhere around 15 to 25 degrees Celsius. Sometimes seed packets will even say the optimal germination temperature for that particular seed. Some seeds prefer light to germinate, and most will prefer darkness, but being under cover of soil. And this is all getting technical, and honestly, it's a little more useful for commercial growers or micro farmers that are starting seeds on a large scale. But I mention it here because it might be useful to, in some cases, maybe if your seeds aren't germinating and you kind of need to troubleshoot what's going on. But honestly, for the home gardener, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Most seeds that are made available to you are available because you'll be able to have success growing them. Where you're going to run into more trouble is trying to grow perennials that normally multiply from cuttings. Those are usually the ones that are going to be a little more finicky. They need light or they need they have these different unique needs. Um, so usually you're doing that if you're trying to breed new varieties or grow some more obscure plants. And that's where you're going to get into some different seed starting conditions. So I just wanted you to be aware of that, but you won't hopefully run into that much. So I know I've thrown a lot of information at you here. My hope is that you can take this knowledge and customize it for your own area. Don't overthink it. So just to sum it all up and bring it all back, in order to direct sow, just scatter some seed, put a little bit of soil over it, tamp it down, and then when it's germination time, either right then or later in the spring, make sure the seeds or seedlings are getting enough water that they need right on that surface, and you'll be amazed at how much you can grow from just a few tiny little seed packets.